In this video, we will be focusing on Aristotle's defense against the arguments made by Plato. Before we move into the particulars of this argument between Plato and Aristotle, let me give you an outline towards the entire argument. Now, as you know, mimesis is what Plato thought about as the process involved in the creation of art. Mimesis means imitation. Aristotle's concept of imitation is different from that of Plato's. For Plato, all imitations are inferior to the original. But Aristotle considers imitation as a dynamic and creative process. Artist is a creator, and thus he imitates things as they ought to be, not always as they are. Imitation takes us from the particular to the universal. That is, by depicting the life of a particular person or an incident, the artist makes it applicable to all human beings. Thus, we can say that with regard to imitation, Aristotle's theories are similar to that of the neoclassical writers, who also focused on the universal rather than the particular. Aristotle argued that imitation should follow internal coherence or the laws of necessity and probability. That is, the incidents in a play or poem should look as if they could happen in the story, even if they may not happen in real life. Imitation is not copying according to Aristotle. Thus, the characters in a play or a poem may appear different from those in real life. But that is how it is supposed to be. In order to understand Aristotle's views and especially the Poetics, it is necessary to know something about the background, both social and literary. In the Athens of the time, the scene was one of political decline and dissolution. Education was in a bad state. The literature of the period, too, was in a state of decline. The golden age of Greek literature was a period of the past. The creative impulse had dried up. Literature had become corrupt, immoral, and of a low level. The decadent poetry of the day aroused hostile criticism instead of attracting readers. Plato's attack on poetry came as substantiation of his view that philosophers were superior and of greater significance than poets. It was because he was acutely conscious of the effect of poetry that he banished poets from his republic of ideal citizens and statesmen. Although he respected the skillful poet named Homer, he was not ready to give poets any place in an ideal state. His attack on poetry was made on several grounds. On intellectual grounds, Plato considered poetry to be a copy of the world of senses and appearances. Poets thus have no knowledge of truth, but merely imitated a copy. Their poetry was thus a copy of a copy, thus leading to his famous argument, poetry is twice removed from reality. The poets were unaware of the ideal world of concepts like truth and beauty. The poets merely copied the phenomenal world, which was a reflection of the ideal. Poetry thus can serve no useful function. On moral grounds, Plato declared that poets had a bad influence on society in the case of social morality, for they cater to popular taste and tell tales of a man's pleasant vices. Secondly, poetry tells lies about gods. Gods are often presented as corrupt, and the tales told of them are immoral. This tends to corrupt public taste and morals. Even Homer, the great poet Homer, does not escape this charge and cannot be suitable for young students to read. Poets and dramatists, in other words, appeal to the baser instincts of man according to Plato. Poetry is also attacked on emotional grounds. That poetry feeds and waters the desire and passions of men instead of drying them up as they ought to. Plato was highly distrustful of the emotions, which, according to him, created for men a sort of illusion. Emotions weaken man and are contradictory to the views of philosophy. The soul has three parts: the rational, the spirited, and the desirous or appetitive. Poetry keeps reasons at abeyance and encourages emotions. People give way to emotional disturbances under the effect of poetry, which they would be ashamed of in real life. Poetry causes imbalance and leads to unrestrained emotional states in which reason is subdued. So we understand that he reacts against poetry, he attacks poetry based on these grounds: the intellectual, the moral, and emotional. Now let's come to the arguments between Aristotle and Plato. Though Plato used the word imitation for poetry, he did so in a derogatory sense. Aristotle too considered poetry as imitation, but he interpreted it as a creative process. Plato considered imitation as mere mimicry. Aristotle widens its scope and insists that it can never be mimicry but has to possess the basic essence of truth. Thus, a poet is greater than a philosopher or historian, for he creates something new by imitating reality. And within reality, there are also emotions. Now, the second argument that Aristotle raised against Plato is, while Plato compared poetry to painting, Aristotle compares it to music. It is thus that Aristotle successfully refutes Plato's charge of poetry imitating mere externalities. It means what you see on the outside. Aristotle says that, like music, poetry captures the soul or essence of experience, internal as well as external. The third argument that Aristotle raises against Plato is that Plato considered poetry to be a copy of nature's as it is. Aristotle gives it the scope of being concerned with what ought to be or what can be. Thus, poetry idealizes the reality. So, thereby, poetry brings out what is good in what you see around you. Moving on to the next counter argument raised by Aristotle, Plato contemns the very fact that poetry arouses emotions. He considered these emotions to be bad for humanity and hence to be curbed if not avoided. Aristotle, however, insists that these emotions should find expression and it can be treated as a saner view than Plato's. The next argument that Plato raised was, Plato regarded poetry to have a bad influence morally, intellectually, and emotionally. And let's look at what Aristotle had to say for that. Aristotle proves that in all these respects, poetry is to be praised for its good and healthy influence. His theory of catharsis tries to show that the effect of poetry can be healthy. Finally, let us look at all the important points that I shared as far as the arguments and counter arguments of Plato and Aristotle are concerned. The first point was regarding the interpretation of the word mimesis or imitation. Plato sees it in a derogatory sense, whereas Aristotle sees it as a creative process. Now, when Plato compared poetry to painting, Aristotle compares it to music. And he says that, like music, poetry captures the soul or essence of experience, internal as well as external. Plato considered poetry to be a copy of whatever you see around you as it is. Aristotle says that poets and poetry concerns itself with what ought to be or what can be, and thereby poetry idealizes the reality. This is the third argument and counter argument. The fourth argument was that Plato condemns the fact that poetry arouses emotions. Aristotle, on the other side, counter argues that emotions should find an expression. And the last argument raised by Plato against poetry was that poetry has a bad influence morally, intellectually, and emotionally upon an individual. Aristotle states that poetry has a good and healthy influence, and thereby he counter argues the argument made by Plato. With this, we come to the end of the session, Aristotle's defense of poetry. In the next session, I will be talking about Aristotle's contributions towards literary criticism in the form of his theory of tragedy. See you in the next lecture. Thank you.